Hello, BookTube. We're continuing our read-along of Christopher Hitchens' book, God Is Not Great. I'm doing this read-along with David Murphy, and we're doing it in a slightly unconventional way. We're reading the book chapter by chapter, one chapter each weekday until we finish. And today is a bit of a rarity. You will already have seen David's video on chapter 15, Religion as an Original Sin. That's the chapter that we're on today to finish out this week, is chapter 15. And David's already posted his video on chapter 15 because he wanted to do it early before he abandons himself the day-long bacchanal orgy that is the Minnesota State Fair. I tell you, he was visibly eager for 14 pounds of fried lard. And who knows if he'll survive. So we may not get his walkthrough of the Wall Street Journal. I have been to the Minnesota State Fair, and it is designed to kill you. But maybe he's made of sturdy pioneer stock. And I can only assume that it was his slavering anticipation of fried corn dogs that made him overlook the fact that in chapter 15 of God Is Not Great, we get an actual mention of economists. Economists come up in this chapter, and he doesn't mention it. Adam Smith, his beloved Adam Smith, is mentioned in this chapter. And there's no... You would expect that if... I forget who the third person is. There are three economists that come up. Karl Marx, Adam Smith, and someone named David Ricardo. And you would think that if Christopher Hitchens mentions not one, not two, but three fundamental economic thinkers, that would have provoked a classic David Murphy 45-minute drone fest. The type of thing that makes his channel all but unwatchable. But no, he was so eager for the state fair. And I, of course, am not going to elaborate on economists, but this is the chapter. David points out in his video that this is actually a very meaty chapter, and it is. It's annoying for me in the way that so many of Hitchens' more theological chapters have been, because his target here is Christianity, is modern Christianity. He, in the back of his mind, simmering in the back of his mind the whole time he was writing this book, was a growing hatred of Wahhabism, of Wahhabi Islam, and its totalitarian leanings, and its viciousness, and its brutality. And he didn't live long enough to see some of the worst examples of that. But really the goal, the target in these chapters is organized Christianity. The original in which he grew up, and he can never forgive it for that. I can almost unconditionally guarantee you that his awakening from that religion did not happen, as we're told in the very first section of the very first chapter of this book, when he was a tiny little tadpole in sandals and short pants. I'd be willing to bet it happened later than that. This disorganized, wailing, furious flailing in all directions is typical of an adult if their awakening from religion happened in late teens, early 20s, which would coincide with Hitchens being, at university surrounded by people who don't think the same way he does. It's the typical pattern. And in some people, the reflection back that they have been hoodwinked for so long makes them so angry that they write a book like this. But this book, this chapter 15, is more concentrated than many of the chapters. It deals with a few of the doctrinal underpinnings of Christianity that Hitchens particularly hates. And he lists them for us, for our convenience. Presenting false pictures of the world to the innocent and the credulous. Also to the learned and the wise. He leaves that out, but Christianity also presented a false picture of the world to the learned and the wise, and much of what we know about our modern world came from those learned and wise people who took that picture and ran with it. So, the doctrine of blood sacrifice, this is completely misunderstood in this chapter, and because Hitchens is, a god to new atheists, they also serially misunderstand this idea. If you listen to a new atheist say that Jesus in his crucifixion was a blood sacrifice, you know right away you're listening to someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. They're parroting things they've heard from other new atheists. The doctrine of atonement, this is also badly misunderstood. I don't really understand how Hitchens could be so widely read on this subject and yet not get this. I guess I attribute it to the marked character defect that had him not be a Catholic. Number 4 is the doctrine of eternal reward or punishment. And number 5 is the imposition of impossible tasks and rules. And the chapter just pinwheels throughout. At first, you think when you're reading, you think, "Oh, this isn't going to be good." Those are great subjects to discuss, but the chapter won't be good because the chapter immediately starts talking about gun-wielding lunatics, crazed cult fanatics. That's the same sort of dirty pool that has typified most of the book, where he will bring up a legitimate theological or philosophical subject and then start talking about crazy people. And now Hitchens' response, if he were here in this room, would be, "They're all crazy. If they're operating under a pure impetus of Christianity and they do these crazy things, then Christianity must account for that." Now that might be true, but it would have a lot more weight to it if you were also using examples of people who took those same tenets and did wonderful things with them. And Hitchens virtually never does that. He mentions there's a passage here that I want to read you because it perfectly underscores what I'm talking about. As to the impossible commands to obey, if you even look at someone with lust, then you have committed adultery. The famous pronouncement of Jesus that Hitchens railed on for the rest of his life as being an injunction against thought crime. At one point in this book, he comes that close to saying that lusting after your neighbor's wife, that lusting after a woman you see on the street, is a spur to human initiative. That it's a good thing. Again, a lot of these points, atonement instead of forgiveness, original sin instead of human nature, a lot of these misunderstandings, if you start with them, you're going to get nowhere in understanding why Christianity, for instance, since that's the subject of this chapter, has appealed so fundamentally to so many people who aren't credulous and simple. the Christians that Hitchens tends to forget exist. Which is, kind of hard. It's kind of amazing that he could be able to do that, since his own brother was one. The kind of Christians who aren't stupid and still find enormous worth and comfort in this stuff. In Hitchens' worldview, at least in this book, those people don't exist. When those people have been 90% to 10%, the majority, there's hardly a member of the 10% minority of lunatics and cross-eyed violent people. There's hardly a member of that 10% that doesn't get a mention in this book. The 90% is virtually virtually nowhere in these pages, and that drives me nuts. But he says, in response to these kinds of impossible demands that Christianity puts on its votaries, they can only be met in one of two ways. The first is by a continual scourging and mortification of the flesh, accompanied by incessant wrestlings with impure thoughts, that's in quotes, which become actual as soon as they are named or even imagined. From this comes hysterical confessions of guilt, false promises of improvement, and loud, violent denunciations of other backsliders and sinners, a spiritual police state. The second solution is organized hypocrisy, where forbidden foods are rebaptized as something else, or where a donation to the religious authorities will purchase some wiggle room, or where ostentatious orthodoxy will buy some time, and where money can be paid into one account and then paid back, with perhaps a slight percentage added in a non-usurious manner, into another. This we might term a spiritual banana republic. Many theocracies, from medieval Rome to modern Wahhabi Saudi Arabia, have managed to be spiritual police states and spiritual banana republics at the same time. This is a book about organized religion, and in a very large part this is about organized Christianity, and you could scarcely find a passage in a school essay by an 8th grader that shows less understanding of organized Christianity than that paragraph does that I just read you, and certainly less sympathy. What was the first part? The first way that you can meet these impossible demands. Keep in mind, the impossible demand that Hitchens is talking about in this particular case, the specific one, is not to look at, in this particular instance, not to look at a woman with lust. And that verse, that injunction, is very much not saying that when you look at a woman, you may not find her attractive. And Hitchens doesn't seem to get that, and so many of his adherents don't get that. They don't get the fact that a faith system that has lived for 2,500 years is probably going to have a little subtlety involved in it. It's probably not just going to be a blunt instrument. The injunction, not to go all Sunday school on you, but the injunction is against lust. Don't lust after someone in your heart. If you lust after someone, you're already guilty of the worst part of the crime. You have already debased them into an object. And Hitchens is saying in this passage that not doing that is impossible, which I think says a lot more about Hitchens than it does about the injunction. The injunction is certainly not one a command to do the impossible. It's a command to better yourself, to improve yourself, to purify yourself, to try to elevate your thoughts. And anyone who can write about organized Christianity in the last 2,000 years and say that a system, a theocratic system, that consistently, every day and at least once every week, urges its millions and millions of followers to better their internal mental state, isn't a good system, is arguing from a place I just don't understand at all. But I wanted to stress that for the very basis of this thing is wrong. Hitchens is saying that the injunction not to lust after someone is impossible. That is not true. You can better yourself. You can make yourself less debased. You can stop thinking of people as objects. You can stop thinking of people as easy marks. You can stop thinking of people as victims of the violence that you will perpetrate. You can be perfect, as your Father in heaven is perfect. You're enjoined to do that on earth by your Messiah. So it's not obviously impossible. But listen to what the alternatives are here. The first way that you can respond to that demand for the impossible, which is not a demand for the impossible any more than if Jesus were to say, don't be gluttonous. What is Hitchens going to say? I guarantee he doesn't actually say it in this book, but I guarantee you if there had been such a command and Hitchens had seen it, he would have said, look at this. The purported savior of Christianity is telling us not to feel hunger. Well, and perhaps the creator of the universe should have made us differently so that we don't feel hunger. When don't be gluttonous is not the same thing as don't feel hunger. But anyway, the first alternative here is the first response is a continual scourging and mortification of the flesh. No one advocates that anymore. Accompanied by incessant wrestlings with impure thoughts, impure is in air quotes, as if lusting after someone isn't impure, to become that become actual as soon as they are named or even imagined. They're actual when they're imagined, right? They're actual when they're imagined. You have committed the base problem by dehumanizing someone in your mind. Whether you ever act on that, you've already done something wrong just to think of them that way. And there's no evil prohibition, there's no proscription against thought crimes involved in that. That is just a call to be a better person, to feel your inner nature, the nature that all humans share, which is original sin. It is not that you are paying for Adam biting an apple. It's not that. That is metaphorical speech. Obviously, that is metaphorical speech. There are characters who eat apples. The forbidden fruit is eaten in the Bible. Obviously, it is metaphorical. Obviously, it's a metaphor for human nature. That is what's passed down from generation to generation. That is what all humans partake of. The nature to be, in Adam's case, disobedient. In Adam's case, ungrateful. In Adam's case, biddable. And so, anyway, I said I wasn't going to go all Sunday school, and I did. But loud, violent denunciations, he says that from this come hysterical confessions of guilt, false promises of improvement, and loud, violent denunciations of other backsliders and sinners. In most of Christian history, it hasn't been loud denunciations. It's been brotherhood, fellowship. You have fallen, so have I. Let's help each other. That is most of Christian history, most of it. Naturally, in this book, the incidents of people pointing and saying, oh, look at that, sinner, sinner, are the ones that get the highlight. But that is not the majority. And if Hitchens had read around in the subject that he's condemning, he would know that. But what's that other thing? False promises of improvement. No. No. Yes, false promises of improvement. Plenty. But also real promises of improvement. Also real promises of improvement. At its heart, Christianity in its better incarnations has for 2,000 years been telling people to make yourself better. Make yourself better. Now, there have been all sorts of dodgy and immoral doctrine. Hitchens mentions the sale of indulgences and whatnot. At the same time that people were selling indulgences in the medieval church, they were also selling extra shares in building projects. They were selling beachfront products, beachfront homes and mountain resorts that did not yet exist or that never were going to exist. In other words, they were committing fraud. Humans were committing fraud all over the world, not just in the Christian world. But the whole time that those things were happening, Christianity was also inculcating into people an inward look That I am not just a beast of the field. I will look inward. I will look at my own impulses and try to control them and even elevate them. And Hitchens would have considered such talk to be just the most inane babbling. On his lecture tours, he used to refer to it as white noise. It would have done a lot better to listen. I myself agree with him that there is not a shred of truth to any of this stuff. I agree with him to the extent of saying that you're living a more honest life to just realize that and do without it. But when he goes on to say that invidious and harmful mythology is all this is and all it's ever been, that's all the effect it's ever had, he loses me, and he should lose you too. The one thing that was my main point about this chapter is that when he talks about original sin, he's misunderstanding it. When he talks about atonement, he's misunderstanding it. When he talks about blood sacrifice, when he or any other new atheist, so to speak, talks about blood sacrifice, says that God had himself sacrificed as a blood sacrifice during the crucifixion. I hardly know where to start. Since Hitchens doesn't really make any inroads into dealing with any of that seriously, I don't feel like I have to in response. This is just a slap of paint across a wall, and it deserves that kind of response. But there is much, much more subtlety in the story of the crucifixion, in the story of the redemption of mankind. That there is much, much more to it than that. It is not that God arranged a blood sacrifice to himself and then now things are hunky-dory. It is that Jesus underwent the crucifixion not to make things hunky-dory, but to open a doorway. I am the door. I am the way. He opened a doorway to a better relationship with God. And I might point out, it's a subject for an entire another string of videos, it's a relationship with a better God. I won't stress it because Hitchens doesn't. The only last point that I wanted to make about this chapter is that I'm kind of amazed. This is one of the only places that Pascal's wager comes up at all in this book. If you talk to Christians and if you deal with brainless Christian apologetics, unfortunately, the thing that must drive people crazy, it must drive intelligent Christians crazy, is not these new atheists. The thing that must drive them crazy, I think of for instance, Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. I think the thing that must drive him crazy is not so much adolescent attacks like this book, but bad apologists. That must make people crazy, religious people. I've known religious people who said, I lose much more sleep over that than I do over stuff like this. This is basically schoolyard, This is basically an adolescent in high school. Everybody who's ever taught any kind of religious studies class, I've taught them myself many, many times. You encounter this. You encounter the 18-year-old who says, can God make a rock bigger than he can lift? The real problem is with apologists who don't know much more than that, who do a very bad job defending the faith when much better jobs are possible. And Pascal's wager is one of the ones that they go to with surprising regularity. They go to Pascal's wager, in which Pascal says, puts forward this idea, that you should profess a belief in the Christian God, whether you believe in him or not. Because if you don't believe in him, and you say that you don't believe in him, then when you die and face eternal judgment, you will go to hell forever for having denied him. Whereas if you do believe in him and you say that you believe in him, you have a good chance of going to heaven, depending on how you've lived your life. But if you don't believe him and you say you do, well, then your profession of faith is all that was necessary and you avoid hell. All for that one simple proclamation. So Pascal's wager is wager that there is a God, that he is watching, and that he does care, and profess the faith, even if you don't feel it. And the thing that Hitchens barely mentions it in this chapter, and he doesn't examine it at all. And the thing that so many people who invoke it, either new atheists or apologists, the thing that so many people fail to understand when they raise Pascal's wager, is that Pascal was being bitingly sarcastic the whole time that he was writing it. He knew Christian scripture as well as anybody else. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, we are told explicitly that God knows your thoughts. So Pascal's wager is exploded. There is no possibility of lying to God. He knows what you think and feel as well as you do. In fact, he knows it before you do. So the very basis of it, Pascal was writing it as a way in a high arch way of pointing out casuistry. He wasn't using it as an actual out. He didn't really believe it, wasn't asking anybody else to really believe it. And yet, I've met so many Christian apologists, even just Christians who aren't apologists, who aren't trying to defend their faith at all. I've met so many people who... Oh, it's Frida's wager. Oh. Last night, around 3 or 4, you could almost feel it happen. Last night, around 3 or 4, a mass of air did move out of here. Oh, baby, you shouldn't be biting me, and you shouldn't be biting me on camera. They all think you're a wonderful dog, and here you are trying to kill me. Just when you thought it was safe to go back in the water. When that mass of air moved out, a few hours later, Frida woke up, and she has been her old self because that huge oppressive blanket of heat and humidity has largely broken, and I think it's just going to get cooler as the days go on. Anyway, as I was saying, not that any of you are paying attention, but I always want to stop such Christians when they say, well, you might as well believe, because you risk everything if you don't. I always want to say to them, you don't know the name of it, but you're getting that from, it's a thing called Pascal's wager, and it was never meant to be taken seriously, not the way you're taking it seriously, so kindly find something else to say to non-believers. But anyway, you're not paying attention now anyway, so I'm going to wrap up this chapter. I do not have an orgiastic state fair to go to, but it doesn't matter anyway. We're presuming that if David Murphy survives his fried corn dogs and 25-cent beer, that he will be back on Monday for chapter 16, which is called Is Religion Child Abuse? And I will be back as well. I am more virtuous. So I will be back without being ruinously hungover. Kids these days, I tell you. Thank you, BookTube.